I'm Professor Barry Marshall, Clinical Professor of Microbiology and Brand Ambassador at the University of Western Australia. I'm known for being one of the duo with Dr. Warren, who discovered Helicobacter pylori, the spiral bacteria that lives in your stomach and causes ulcers and stomach cancer. So before we did our work, everyone thought ulcers were caused by stress, and of course they're incurable. Everyone had them all their life. And so it was a major breakthrough to find Helicobacter pylori was the cause, and that meant that you could easily cure ulcers just with a course of antibiotics. I got into medical research mainly because after graduating from medicine, I started to see patients and I realized that so many patients are without a diagnosis. So I was just interested in finding things out and hopefully finding a cure for people. And so I did see people with ulcers and plenty of other diseases, discussed it with my peers and professors there, and I was encouraged to try and do some research on it. When I joined up with Dr. Warren and we started that, it was probably middle of 1981. I was 30 years old and I was into my final years of training to be an internal medicine doctor. I was just wanting to do some research on these bacteria. And after we had studied about 100 people, and looked at all their results, we could see that if patients had ulcers, they nearly all had the bacteria. So in a prospective blinded study, which is the way you test things in medicine, is we studied 100 people coming to have the scope down and look in the stomach, and we took a biopsy sample from their stomach wall in every person, and I sent that sample to Dr. Warren, but I didn't tell him what was wrong with them, and he had to then see if the bacteria were there or there's anything wrong with it. And then I had a culture for the microbiology, and I sent that to the microbiologist, told him nothing else. And then I had data on what was found in the stomach, whether they had an ulcer or a hiatus hernia, all those common things. Sent that to the statistician. So whether the people had stress or not, it was pretty evident that made absolutely no difference to whether or not they had ulcers. Whenever I presented this work about the stomach bacteria, everyone will say, well, Dr. Marshall, we think people with ulcers have something wrong with their immune system. They just catch this bacteria after they got the ulcer. So you're wasting your time. It's just one of the things that you see, bacteria sticking near ulcers. So although I was very excited about the research, we still had this problem that gastroenterologists really didn't believe it. They could see that acid had something to do with it, and the treatment was going to be acid blockers. And all the pharmaceutical companies by then were working on acid blockers, like antacid type treatments. But we recognized that when you stop the treatment, stop the acid blockers, the ulcers always came back. So the underlying problem, if it was stress or if it was bacteria, that was the issue. So one of the things that spurred us on with our research, and it was a struggle for us, was to get funding from the National Health and Medical Research Council. And we submitted our early preliminary data on 100 patients into the local gastroenterology meeting, which was being held in Perth. And so we were excited about it. We said, not only is it going to be in Perth, but we've made a breakthrough which could be the cure for ulcers. But then they rejected it. And so it's always very heartbreaking when your research paper is rejected. So I actually have my rejection letter from 1983. One of the things that really helped was the seed funding I received from Royal Perth Hospital Research Foundation, which was funded by their clinical staff initially, I believe. So I had some resources. I think I had some computing resources. I certainly had a lot of resources for the animal research experiment. Warren and I had been working on these bacteria at that stage for 3 years, and we were just hitting a brick wall with this business about how do you prove the bacteria really causes these problems rather than just an effect after the event. So I planned the experiment. I had an endoscope to show that I was totally normal, stomach good, no ulcers or inflammation. And then I got the bacteria from a patient. This was a patient who I had treated with antibiotics and cured that patient of the bacteria. So I thought, well, if I get ulcers, I can take some antibiotics, the same ones, and probably be cured. So I was a little bit cautious about it. And one Tuesday in 1984, in July, I remember, I drank a couple of Petri dishes full of bacteria. About 5 days after I drank the bacteria, and I was starting to feel a bit squeamish. And I was there like, I've seen a lot of patients with these sort of symptoms over the years, and everyone says, oh yeah, nervous stomach, functional dyspepsia, one of these vague diagnoses, stress. And then I started vomiting every morning for 4 or 5 mornings. And so then I had the endoscopy after 10 days. And lo and behold, the biopsy showed those bacteria were everywhere, and the white cells were fighting them and eating the bacteria, and the poor old lining of my stomach was just kind of falling to bits. It was like wet blotting paper. It was a great story that we put together, and we published it in 1984 and 1985. And nobody believed it for 10 years. But of course, the scientific process is that everybody has to try and prove you wrong. And when they fail, they say, maybe he's right. So we had to be patient then and do a lot of work for another 10 years before everyone said, okay, that's the cause. And then you move on from there. So how do you get rid of it? Warren and I remember we were celebrating our first Lancet paper in Subiaco. Warren's wife, Wynne, said, you guys could win the Nobel Prize for this. And we thought, well, maybe we could win the Nobel Prize one day, hopefully not too many years away. So Dr. Warren retired, and each Nobel Prize Day, which is the first Monday in October, I would go and pick him up from home and take him to the Swan Brewery restaurant. We would sit there beside the river and have fish and chips and have a couple of beers. And then we would listen to the Nobel Prizes, because in Australia they get announced at 5:30 in the evening. And so several years went by, year 2000, 2001, 2002, we're like, oh, we're never going to win it. But it was a nice tradition, and so we kept doing it. And then one day, 2005, we'd pretty much given up at that stage, and his phone rang. And he was there, hello, this is Dr. Warren. And then there was a Swedish voice on the end, Dr. Warren, you've won the Nobel Prize. And then they said, but Dr. Warren, we can't find Dr. Marshall. We're not allowed to announce it till we've spoken to Dr. Marshall in person. Oh, it's a dilemma. The deadline is nearly here, because it was about 5:15 at that stage. And he said, oh, well, Barry's here with me. We're having a beer. And you can talk to him. So he handed the phone over to me. So I got the message as well. I would say that one of the most important things that the Royal Perth Hospital Research Foundation can do is provide seed money and encouragement for young investigators, and make sure that they can get into a forum where they can argue with people, present their findings. So anybody who can get some seed funding and get an extra day a week that's protected to do research, that sort of thing, very, very valuable. I say to people who donate for research, the journey should be just as much fun as the outcome. These days, there's all kinds of things that happen in the Research Foundation. There's activities, of course, but as the research develops by different young investigators, the donors can see that happening and get a lot of satisfaction out of their donation. That person might produce headlines overseas, and the information comes back. You see that person on the news, and maybe, possibly even winning a Nobel Prize, and you can say, well, I participated in that, I helped it. And isn't it great to be in Western Australia where we can do that? So it's a great time to celebrate the 40th anniversary of the Royal Perth Hospital Research Foundation. 1983 was a watershed for so many different diseases, and it was a great time to start. And I had help from the Research Foundation. And here we are 40 years later, and the discovery made in Royal Perth Hospital has benefited millions of people and might save maybe 1 million lives a year. I'm always amazed at the stuff I see here in Perth and the quality of investigators here. So keep it up, Royal Perth Hospital Research Foundation.